I have spent more than 3 decades walking through crime scenes that never stop echoing in a detective's memory. There are cases that close cleanly, pieces that fit puzzles that click. And then there are cases that do not end, cases that haunt the walls of every investigation room they enter. The disappearance of 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling is one of those cases. It begins in a quiet town in rural Minnesota, a place that seemed too peaceful for anything truly sinister, and yet it became the epicenter of one of the longest and most emotionally devastating child abduction investigations in American history. Tonight, I will take you back to October the 22nd, 1989. The night the world of a small town cracked open. The night a child vanished into the darkness. The night that shaped everything that came after. St. Joseph was the kind of town where parents waved from their porches, where kids biked freely through neighborhoods, where the silence of the countryside was comforting rather than threatening. People believed danger lived somewhere far away in cities with neon lights and sirens. Out here, the loudest thing at night was the wind brushing through the cornfields. But that illusion shattered the moment Jacob disappeared. And when I started reviewing the case years later, I realized the warning signs had been there all along. A series of assaults on young boys in nearby towns, strange reports of a masked man stalking children, an unidentified predator moving like a shadow just outside the line of sight. No one connected those crimes at the time. If they had, everything might have been different. That is the tragedy of hindsight. It always arrives too late. To understand what happened to Jacob, you must first understand the innocence of that night. Jacob, his younger brother Trevor, and their friend Aaron were just boys doing something simple and sweet. It was a Sunday evening, and they wanted to rent a video and buy some candy. They convinced Jacob's parents to let them ride their bikes to the local convenience store. It was just a short ride down a familiar road, the kind of decision thousands of parents made across America every day. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt dangerous. Jacob wore his red jacket, the one he liked. The boys rode off under a sky lit by moonlight, talking about movies and Halloween plans. That is the last time Jacob's parents saw him alive. When the boys finished buying snacks and a videotape, they started to pedal back home. The road was quiet. There were no cars passing, no people outside, no lights except for the faint glow of a farmhouse window up ahead. They could see their breath in the cool Minnesota air. And then everything changed. A man stepped out of the darkness. He held a gun. His face was covered. His voice was sharp and deep. He ordered them to stop. He told them to get off their bikes and lie face down on the ground. The boys obeyed instantly, trembling. They did not scream. They did not run. They were children confronted with a nightmare where they had no framework to understand. The man asked each boy his age. Trevor was 10. Aaron was 11. Jacob was 11. For reasons no one will ever fully understand, the man pointed at Jacob. He told the other two to run and not look back. And then he took Jacob with him into the darkness. The entire abduction lasted less than a minute. A single minute that would unravel decades of searching legislation, heartbreak, and unanswered questions. When I replay these moments in my mind, I see the road exactly as it was described. A narrow rural path, flanked by fields, silence thick enough to swallow sound, a world where help could not arrive fast enough even if someone had known to call for it. I imagine the seconds after the abductor disappeared with Jacob. 2 children running in blind terror, the air burning in their lungs, the sound of their footsteps on gravel, the disbelief that something so monstrous had just happened. Jacob's brother running home to tell his parents that Jacob was gone, a sentence no parent should ever hear. Within minutes, the search began. Neighbors grabbed flashlights and raced outside. Police arrived and began scanning the area. Cars, dogs, helicopters, everything that could be mobilized was mobilized. But the truth was already unavoidable. Jacob was gone. And the man who took him knew exactly what he was doing. He left no fingerprints, no footprints that could be traced with certainty, no vehicle tracks that could be confirmed as his. The scene offered almost nothing. No clue, no usable evidence. It was the perfect crime in a place least prepared for it. I have reviewed the original incident reports countless times. I have walked that road, stood in the same spots the boys once stood, listened to the wind move through the same fields. Every time I feel the same thing. The abductor was not improvising. He had watched, he had waited. He had chosen his moment with precision. He knew the road, the darkness, the curve where the boys would pass. He understood the terrain better than they did. And he controlled the situation in a way that only comes from experience. This was not the first child he stalked. It was only the first that gained national attention. The case exploded across Minnesota. Police set up roadblocks and interviewed residents. The FBI joined within 24 hours. More than 50,000 tips would eventually flood in over the years. But none of them led to Jacob. The community shattered overnight. Children who once rode bikes freely were now kept inside. Parents who once trusted their town suddenly felt watched. A single act of violence rewrote the identity of an entire region. And yet, amid all this chaos, the man responsible simply went home. He blended back into ordinary life. No one suspected him enough to act decisively. No one knew he had already silenced Jacob forever. At the time, investigators operated with the tools they had, but the year was 1989. DNA science was primitive. Criminal profiling was still evolving, and the idea that a local resident could commit such a calculated abduction did not fit the initial theories. Many believed the suspect must have been an outsider, a transient offender passing through. This assumption diverted attention away from the truth that the predator was living among them. I spent years piecing together why the case stalled so quickly. The answer is simple, but painful. There was no evidence. There was no pattern recognized. And there was no sense of urgency to examine earlier assaults that were clear preludes to Jacob's abduction. The clues were there. They were simply invisible because no one had the perspective to see them. What makes this case unforgettable is not just the horror of that night. It is the realization that Jacob's fate was sealed within hours of his disappearance. The man who took him acted swiftly, cruelly, decisively. And Jacob, a boy who only wanted candy and a movie, never had a chance. When an abduction unfolds with such precision that it leaves almost no physical evidence behind, investigators are forced to study not only what is present, but what is absent. Silence itself becomes a clue. Emptiness becomes a map. And in the weeks following Jacob Wetterling's disappearance, silence was all we had. I've often revisited those early weeks, trying to understand how the trail turned cold so quickly. But the truth is a harsh one. The shadow that took Jacob had been moving through Minnesota for years, and no one had seen him clearly enough to stop him. In the days immediately after the abduction, law enforcement did what any department would do when confronted with a crime that shocked the entire state. They cast a wide net across Stearns County. Officers walked through fields along riverbanks into barns and abandoned sheds. Volunteers formed search lines that stretched across farmland. Helicopters hovered over cornfields, looking for disturbed soil or discarded clothing. Hundreds of people searched for a boy who had already been taken far beyond their reach. I have spoken to officers who were there in those early hours. They described a sense of urgency so intense it felt like adrenaline had taken hold of an entire community. But adrenaline cannot outrun a man who had planned every detail. One of the first investigative challenges was the overwhelming flood of tips. America watched the case unfold on national news. Phone lines jammed with people reporting strangers' suspicious vans, men seen near playgrounds in towns hundreds of miles away. It became nearly impossible to distinguish genuine leads from noise. 50,000 tips would pour in over 27 years. Buried somewhere in that mountain of information was the truth. But mountains swallow things, truth included. As I continued to immerse myself in the case, I found the most troubling detail was not in the thousands of pages of reports, but in the consistency of the story told by those who had been victimized before Jacob. Years earlier, boys in Painesville, Cold Spring, and surrounding areas described being attacked by a masked man who accosted them at night. He ambushed them suddenly, controlled them with confidence, and vanished just as quickly. The descriptions were unsettlingly similar. A man who blended in, a man who stalked isolated roads, a man who understood fear and how to use it. These boys survived, but they carried trauma that echoed Jacob's final night. And yet at the time, none of these cases were connected. They lived in separate drawers of police filing cabinets, waiting for someone to realize they belonged to the same hand. When I first reviewed these earlier assaults, a picture began to sharpen. A predator with a pattern. A predator who knew the backroads of Minnesota intimately. A predator whose escalating boldness should have been a red flag long before October 1989. But hindsight is cruel in that it reveals everything too late. Minnesotans trusted the rural quiet. They trusted the safety of small towns. That trust allowed the shadow to move unnoticed. One of the persistent problems investigators faced was the lack of forensic evidence. The abductor had not left fingerprints on the boys' bicycles. There were no tire tracks that could be definitively linked to him. Soil samples around the abduction site, diluted under the pressure of dozens of boots walking through the area. The original scene was compromised simply because no one had expected a sophisticated criminal to strike there. Everyone was learning as they went, but they were learning too slowly to make a difference for Jacob. During interviews, the two boys who witnessed the abduction described the man as calm, assertive, and frighteningly controlled. He did not hesitate. He did not stutter. He did not panic. He issued commands that the boys instinctively obeyed, as if he had done this before. I have talked to psychologists who specialize in criminal behavior, and they all point to the same conclusion. Only a repeat offender displays that kind of command over a crime scene. That level of confidence comes from practice, not impulse. Another critical misstep was the assumption that the abduction had been committed by an outsider, a stranger from another city. A man passing through. Investigators searched highways, bus stations, and airports. They monitored reports of drifters and interstate travelers. But the shadow lived much closer. He lived inside the very community that feared him. He knew the roads, the fields, and the routines of the families who lived there. When the sun rose the morning after the abduction, he could step outside and blend in as another neighbor shaken by the tragedy. The familiarity he had with the area was something investigators overlooked, partly because no one wanted to believe that someone local was capable of such evil. As I reconstructed the investigative process, I realized that law enforcement had been operating under a fog of confusion. Each lead seemed important, yet insufficient. Vehicles were described differently by witnesses. Suspects were named but quickly ruled out. Polygraph tests brought more uncertainty than clarity. Every path led to another path, never to a destination. It is difficult for the public to understand what that kind of investigative paralysis feels like. But the officers I interviewed described it as trying to chase a ghost whose footprints disappeared the moment you bent down to look at them. There were moments when investigators were close to the truth without knowing how close. A man named in earlier assault reports lived only a few miles away. His behavior raised suspicion. His movements on the night of the abduction were inconsistent. But without evidence linking him directly to Jacob, the case against him seemed circumstantial, and circumstantial was not enough for an arrest. Time and again he slipped through the cracks. A case like this does more than strain investigative resources. It fractures communities. Parents no longer let their children bike to the store. Kids once comfortable wandering fields and forests now stayed indoors. Trust eroded. Fear spread. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the psychological toll on Jacob's parents. They fought tirelessly, appearing on national television, speaking to legislators, pushing for better laws. Their pain fueled change across the United States. But at its core, their grief remained anchored to one unbearable truth. They did not know where their son was or what had happened to him. There is an image that often returns to me when I think about this part of the investigation. It is not from the night of the abduction. It is from years later when the Wetterling home remained frozen in time. Jacob's room stayed exactly as it was the day he left. The posters, the books, the pillow on the bed. It felt like a quiet plea to the universe to bring him home. Families of missing children live in a place somewhere between hope and despair, a place where time does not move forward. Investigators feel that same stagnation when a case refuses to progress. Every unanswered question becomes a weight that grows heavier with each passing year. By the early 90s, investigators had run down every logical lead. The case had become national news. America wanted answers, but the silence grew deeper. Newspapers printed artists' renderings of potential suspects. Television networks broadcast reenactments. Psychics called offering visions. None of it brought them closer to the truth. The shadow stayed hidden. Years passed, then a decade, then another. New detectives inherited the case file. Fresh eyes examined old evidence. Patterns emerged too late to save Jacob, but they hinted at something vital. This predator had been active not just on the night Jacob disappeared. He had been active long before, and he might still be active somewhere else. When I reached this point in my investigation, I knew that the story of Jacob's disappearance was not only about one tragic night. It was about the years of oversight, missed opportunities, and assumptions that allowed the shadow to remain undetected. A predator does not simply appear out of nowhere. He grows in the dark, refining his methods until the perfect moment arrives. Part 2 of this documentary is the moment we start tracing that shadow backward, realizing how close investigators came to stopping him and how far they still were from understanding the full extent of his crimes. It is where the tragedy deepens because the signs were there. They were waiting for someone to notice. But no one did. Not yet. There is a point in every long-term investigation when the silence becomes heavier than the case files stacked across the office floor. A point where the unanswered questions grow so large that they cast a shadow over every new lead and every old report. By the mid-1990s, the investigation into the disappearance of Jacob Wetterling had reached that point. What began as a frantic statewide search had transformed into a cold, suffocating uncertainty. It was a darkness that stretched for decades, swallowing hope and replacing it with a single agonizing question that repeated endlessly in the minds of investigators and the Wetterling family. Where is Jacob? I have always believed that the most difficult cases are not the ones filled with chaos and evidence scattered everywhere. It is the cases that leave you with too little. Absence is a void that consumes everything around it. That is what the Wetterling case became in the years following the initial investigation. The files grew thicker, the binders heavier, the theories more complex, yet everything remained anchored to an empty space where a child once stood. Those early years were filled with interviews that repeated like a cycle that refused to break. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, distant acquaintances, and people who had simply been driving through Stearns County on the night of the abduction. Each conversation felt promising for a moment, only to dissolve into disappointment. Witnesses remembered fragments: a car speeding away, a strange man near a gas station earlier that evening, a voice they thought they recognized. But memory is a fragile instrument vulnerable to time fear and imagination. What seemed clear in the days after the abduction turned blurry months later. And after a few years, even the most vivid recollections became mere shadows. One of the most devastating realities was that the Wetterling family lived through these years with a kind of suspended grief. They could not mourn because there was no body. They could not celebrate progress because the investigation had none. They lived inside a never-ending before and after, trapped in the moment Jacob vanished. I remember watching interviews from the mid-90s, seeing Patty Wetterling speak with a strength that seemed almost superhuman. Her voice never wavered, even when the weight of uncertainty pressed hardest against her. She refused to let the world forget Jacob. She refused to let the shadow win. The investigation evolved during these years, not because of new leads, but because of the relentless determination of those involved. Detectives cycled in and out of the case. Some retired. Some transferred. New investigators arrived with fresh eyes and unbroken spirits, only to eventually feel the gravity of the same invisible wall. I spoke with several of them years later. They described the case as something alive, something that took root in their minds. They said it followed them home at night, interrupting sleep with questions that never found answers. Technology was advancing, but not fast enough. DNA analysis was improving in laboratories nationwide, yet none of the physical materials recovered from the scene matched anyone in available databases. There was nothing to compare. No biological evidence left behind. The abductor had stripped the scene clean before he even arrived. He had chosen a location where isolation acted as the perfect accomplice. He had brought a gun, used his voice as control, and left nothing behind except fear. Throughout the late 90s, the case became synonymous with long-term investigative despair. National programs on missing children referenced Jacob regularly. Conferences on criminal behavior used the case as an example of the dangers of rural complacency. The Wetterling Act, passed in 1994, created the first national sex offender registry in the United States. It was a monumental shift in public policy, but even this victory could not provide answers about Jacob himself. Every legislative change was a bittersweet reminder of the boy the world could not find. There were a few moments during these dark years when investigators believed they were close to something meaningful. A newly remembered detail, a vehicle description that matched something from an earlier report. A man in another state arrested for crimes that resembled the pattern of Minnesota's masked attacker. But each lead eroded under scrutiny. None of them led to Jacob. None provided closure. They were echoes of similar monsters, but not the one responsible for the night that shattered a town. A case of this magnitude also attracts the bizarre. Self-proclaimed psychics flooded the Wetterlings with letters and phone calls. Some claimed Jacob was alive and being held in a basement. Others insisted he was in another state entirely. One even suggested he had been taken by a cult. None of it helped. It only added emotional weight to a family already drowning in unanswered questions. I remember reading through archived records showing how many times the Wetterlings answered the same painful inquiries from reporters. What would you say to Jacob now? Do you believe he is still alive? How do you keep going? They answered with grace each time, but the toll was silent and immense. Grief, stretched across years, becomes something profound and corrosive. It settles into every corner of a home, every sentence left unfinished, every holiday with one chair empty. Through all this, a name kept appearing in the case files, a man mentioned in earlier attacks, a man who lived not far from the abduction site. His name was present, but never dominant. It floated on the edges of the investigation like a ghost. He had been questioned before, polygraphed, watched, but nothing linked him definitively to Jacob. Without evidence, suspicion becomes a burden rather than a breakthrough. Investigators could not act, and as time moved on, his name blended into the thousands of others mentioned across decades of reporting. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Minnesota, other boys were growing into adulthood with memories they wished they could forget. Memories of being attacked late at night, held down by a masked man told not to scream. The attacks were brutal, swift, and calculated. I spoke with psychologists who reviewed these assault patterns, and they all agreed that the offender displayed a level of control and confidence indicating prior experience. This was not a man who acted impulsively. This was a man who honed his methods across time. In retrospect, the parallels between these assaults and Jacob's abduction are painfully clear. Yet at the time, they remained separate threads scattered across different jurisdictions. By the early 2000s, the Wetterling case had reached full stagnation. The FBI still kept it open. Minnesota authorities maintained an active file. But no new evidence emerged. Even the evolving sex offender registry, while immensely helpful in countless cases nationwide, could not retroactively identify the man who had taken Jacob. He had avoided detection long enough to predate systems designed to stop men like him. The turn of the millennium brought new hope in the form of improving forensic capabilities. Digital databases expanded. Old evidence across thousands of cases nationwide was tested and retested. Some investigators wondered if perhaps the abductor had left something behind without realizing it. A fiber, a skin cell, a trace the technology of 1989 could not detect. But analysis after analysis returned the same result. Nothing. The absence continued, mocking the efforts of everyone searching for the truth. These were the darkest years, the years when the public gradually shifted its attention to new tragedies, new headlines, new missing children whose faces filled posters and television screens. But for those closest to the case, time did not move. It simply repeated itself day after day. For the Wetterlings, each morning began with the same thought. This might be the day we learn something, and each night ended with the same void. Not today. As I reconstructed these years for this documentary, I realized something powerful. Long-term darkness is not just the absence of light, it is the erosion of belief. Investigators begin to doubt their instincts. Families begin to doubt their strength. Communities begin to doubt their safety. And in that void, a predator remains free, walking through life as though nothing happened. While a state mourns, he sleeps soundly. While investigators obsess over files, he lives his ordinary days. While a family waits for their child to come home, he knows the truth they will not learn for decades. The greatest tragedy of these years is not simply that Jacob was missing. It is that the man responsible lived without consequence, without suspicion strong enough to stop him, without fear that anyone was getting closer to the truth. He lived through the 90s, through the 2000s, through the first part of the 2010s. Decades passed while he stayed hidden in plain sight. But every darkness eventually meets a fracture, a small tear where the first sliver of light enters. For the Wetterling case, that fracture came from a lead so ordinary, investigators almost overlooked it, a detail buried under decades of paperwork, a piece of information connected to the earlier assaults in Painesville. It was not dramatic. It was not immediate, but it was the beginning of the unraveling. In Part 4, we step into the moment when that sliver of light pierced the darkness. It is where the decades-long silence began to break. It is where the shadow finally started to reveal its shape. And it is where the truth long buried began its painful rise to the surface. There are cases where the truth arrives like a storm, sudden, violent, impossible to ignore. But the Wetterling case was not one of them. The truth in this investigation did not arrive with sirens or a dramatic confession. It came quietly, like a faint crack forming along the surface of a wall that had stood unbroken for nearly 3 decades. And it began with a detail so small that countless investigators had glanced at it without realizing that it was the key that would eventually unlock everything. When I first reviewed the rediscovered Painesville assault reports, I remember feeling an unease settle into my chest. The assaults described were not random, nor were they clumsy attempts by an inexperienced offender. They were practiced, controlled, executed with the same methodical precision that defined the abduction of Jacob Wetterling. A masked man, a gun or the threat of one, late-night attacks, children forced to the ground, a sudden retreat into darkness. These were not coincidences. They were fingerprints, psychological fingerprints left behind by a single offender perfecting his craft. The crimes in Painesville were the prelude to one of the most infamous abductions in American history. For years, these reports sat in separate files, separated by jurisdiction and time, overlooked by a system that had not yet learned to thread together seemingly isolated assaults. But as new detectives revisited the case in the early 2010s, they began to see what earlier investigators could not. They noticed patterns, similarities in descriptions, phrases repeated across interviews conducted years apart. A man with a build resembling that of a specific local resident. A gait witnessed by multiple victims. A voice described as calm but commanding. And above all, the attacker's ability to disappear into the community without leaving a trace. This was a man who did not travel far to commit his crimes. He hunted at home. One name began to rise through the paperwork like a ghost resurfacing after decades underwater. It was the name that had appeared in earlier files, the one investigators had circled, without the power to act, the name of a man who had been questioned and released because the evidence was never enough. His name was not yet a confession, nor was it a revelation. It was simply a possibility becoming impossible to ignore. The man was Danny Heinrich. Heinrich had lived close to the abduction site in 1989. He had been on investigators' radar early, questioned repeatedly, even polygraphed. But nothing tied him directly to Jacob. Without solid evidence, the case could not center around him. And so he drifted through the edges of the investigation like a shadow too blurred to define. But something changed in the 2010s. Investigators began to revisit the physical evidence taken in earlier cases around Painesville and Cold Spring assaults that bore the unmistakable signature of the same masked attacker. They also examined fibers and shoe impressions that had once been believed too vague to matter. They reviewed the old interviews with boys who had survived attacks. Many described a man who seemed both confident and nervous, someone familiar with the back roads and farmland, someone who acted as if he belonged in the community. And when the details were layered together, a portrait formed. It was not a complete portrait, but it had a shape, a silhouette that now resembled Heinrich more than anyone else. Still, suspicion alone could not reopen a case that had stagnated for decades. Investigators needed something concrete, something indisputable, and that moment arrived through a seemingly unrelated avenue. The FBI was conducting a routine review of old evidence as part of a broader initiative to close long-standing child abduction cases. In this process, they discovered that Heinrich's DNA matched samples from an unsolved assault in Cold Spring, Another case in the same region committed years before Jacob was taken. It was the first physical evidence tying Heinrich to a pattern of crimes that investigators now realized had been committed by the same person. I remember reading that match report for the first time. It felt like a breath held for decades was finally released. For the first time, the darkness surrounding Jacob's disappearance flickered with light. Investigators could now prove Heinrich was not just a man of interest. He was a predator with a documented history, a man capable of the violence that had haunted Minnesota for years. And if he had committed those assaults, he was almost certainly the shadow behind Jacob's abduction. With this breakthrough, investigators focused their efforts entirely on Heinrich. They monitored him, they re-interviewed him, they examined his financial records, his movement patterns, his behaviors. Yet Heinrich remained silent. He refused to talk about Jacob. He refused to give investigators the closure they needed. He lived in a modest home, worked occasional jobs, and blended into the community as if he had nothing to hide. But investigators knew better now. They knew they were looking at a man who had eluded justice for decades. The search of Heinrich's home marked the turning point of the entire investigation. Officers expected to find traces of his past assaults. What they found was far worse. Thousands of images of child exploitation, trophies, evidence of a man who had never stopped being dangerous. He had simply become better at hiding. There was no DNA linking him to Jacob. No clothing, no weapon, but the psychological profile, the geographic profile, the timeline, the escalation. Everything pointed to one undeniable truth. Heinrich was capable of abducting and killing a child, and he had done it before. The discovery of illegal material was the legal opening investigators needed. Heinrich was arrested, but he still refused to confess. He denied involvement in Jacob's disappearance, even as the evidence around him grew heavier. He insisted he knew nothing, but the pressure was mounting. The community sensed something shifting. After years of silence, after decades of questions, the shape hidden in the darkness was finally beginning to sharpen. Still, Heinrich held the final card. Without a confession, without a body, without direct evidence tying him to Jacob, prosecutors could not charge him with murder. The law required more than suspicion, no matter how overwhelming that suspicion had become. And so investigators turned to the one strategy left: leverage. They crafted a deal. Heinrich would face federal charges for possession of child exploitation material charges that carried a heavy sentence. But in exchange for avoiding a lifetime in prison, he would have to do something he had avoided for 27 years. He would have to tell the truth about what happened to Jacob Wetterling. When Heinrich agreed to the plea deal, it was the first crack in a fortress built of lies and silence. What followed was a confession so cold, so emotionless, that even seasoned investigators felt its impact like a punch to the chest. Heinrich described the night of October the 22nd, 1989, not with sorrow or hesitation, but with the detachment of a man recalling a mundane errand. He detailed how he had abducted Jacob, where he had taken him, what he had done, and how he had killed him when he feared being identified. He described burying the boy in a field, and then years later returning to dig up the remains and rebury them elsewhere. His confession was not a revelation. It was a confirmation of the fear that had lingered in Minnesota for decades. When investigators accompanied Heinrich to the burial site, a quiet patch of farmland, they found fragments of clothing, bones, and the remnants of a life stolen far too soon. Among them was a single red shirt, the same one Jacob had worn the night he disappeared. It was the final proof the world needed. The silence had finally broken. The truth had finally come to light. The years of darkness had ended. But the light that replaced them was not warm. It was harsh. It was painful. It revealed a truth the Wetterling family had prayed they would never have to face. Jacob had not been alive all those years. He had not been waiting. He had been gone since the night he disappeared. There are truths that heal. There are truths that liberate. And there are truths that burn. The truth about what happened to Jacob Wetterling belongs to the third kind. It is a truth so devastating, so heavy, that even when it finally emerged after 27 years buried under silence and fear, it did not bring peace. It brought clarity, yes. It brought answers, but peace was nowhere in sight. Because peace does not grow from brutality. Peace does not grow from a life cut short. Peace does not grow from the death of an 11-year-old boy who simply wanted to rent a movie and buy some candy. I remember the day I first watched the footage from the courtroom where Danny Heinrich delivered his confession. The room was silent, as though everyone inside understood they were about to hear the end of a story that had haunted Minnesota for decades. Heinrich's voice was flat, detached. He spoke not like a man confessing, but like someone reading instructions from a manual. His tone never changed, not when he described abducting Jacob, not when he described assaulting him, not even when he described firing the shot that ended Jacob's life. There was no tremor in his voice, no remorse, no humanity. Heinrich described the final moments with precision that made the cruelty almost unbearable to hear. He recalled pulling over to a remote area. He recalled Jacob asking a question that must pierce the soul of any human being who hears it. Jacob asked, "What did I do wrong?" It was the question of a child who believed that the world was fair, that logic could explain danger, that being good would keep him safe. But monsters do not follow logic. They follow desire. They follow impulse. They follow the darkness inside themselves. When Heinrich admitted he shot Jacob because he feared being caught, the courtroom held its breath. It was not rage that filled the room. It was heartbreak. Rage had come years earlier, when hope was still alive. But heartbreak is different. It is quieter. It sinks into the bones. It wraps around the heart like a weight that cannot be lifted. For investigators, for the Wetterlings, for the entire state, the truth confirmed what they had always feared. Jacob had not suffered for days or weeks. His life was taken within hours. The next moment in the courtroom, the moment that remains etched in my memory, came when the prosecutor read aloud the details of Heinrich revisiting the burial site. Years after killing Jacob, he returned to dig up the remains. He moved them to another location. He did this not out of guilt or conscience, but out of fear that time or chance would expose his secret. He disturbed Jacob's resting place because he wanted to remain hidden. That act alone reveals the full depth of Heinrich's selfishness and the absence of any moral compass. When investigators found Jacob's red shirt at the site identified by Heinrich, it was as if the past had finally opened its eyes. For 27 years, that shirt had been waiting beneath the soil, a silent witness to the crime. A piece of a boy's life that refused to disappear even when everything else had. And when it resurfaced, the story of Jacob Wetterling became unshakably real again. No longer a mystery, no longer a question, just truth. Raw, final, irrefutable. I spoke with investigators who were there when the remains were recovered. They told me the air felt thicker, as though the world understood that something sacred had been disturbed. Some of them cried. Some stood still and let the reality settle over them. Others placed a hand on the earth as though offering a silent apology to a boy who never should have been hurt. In those moments, the distance between past and present collapsed. Jacob was no longer a name in a file. He was a child returned home in the quietest, saddest way imaginable. When news of the discovery spread across Minnesota, the state seemed to pause. For years, people had carried Jacob's face in their hearts, on posters, on bumper stickers in vigils. They had imagined him alive, imagined him growing up, imagined him becoming the man he never got to be. And now, all that remained was the fact that he had been gone almost from the moment he vanished. Grief swept through communities like a cold wind. Schools held moments of silence. Radio hosts choked on their words. Strangers placed flowers at the Wetterling home, even if they had never met the family. Pain has a way of binding people together, and Minnesota felt that bond deeply. But something else happened, too. Something rare. The discovery of the truth did not extinguish hope. Instead, it transformed it. The Wetterlings refused to let Jacob's story end in darkness. They channeled their sorrow into advocacy, pushing for stronger laws, pushing for better protections for children across America. They turned their grief into momentum. That momentum reshaped the country. Without Jacob's case, national sex offender registries would not exist in the form they do today. Without the determination of his family, countless laws aimed at protecting children would have remained ideas instead of reality. I often think about the strange duality of tragedy. How one child's stolen life became a catalyst for protecting millions of others. It is not a fair trade. It is not justice. Justice would have been Jacob walking home that night. Justice would have been him, growing up, celebrating birthdays, falling in love, building a life. Justice would have been him living, but since justice did not come, change did. And that change carries Jacob's name. In the final phase of this investigation, as I reconstructed the steps that led to the truth, I realized something profound. The power of a story lies not only in the answers it provides, but in the questions it leaves behind. And Jacob's story leaves many. What if earlier assaults had been connected sooner? What if technology had advanced just a little faster? What if someone had recognized the shadow for what it was before it became a monster? These questions do not change the outcome, but they shape our understanding of the world. They remind us that evil rarely appears suddenly. It grows, it hides, it waits for opportunity, and it thrives when communities assume it cannot exist among them. The Wetterling case exposed a painful truth about human nature. We prefer to believe that danger comes from the outside. We prefer to believe that the monsters live elsewhere, far from our neighborhoods, far from our families. But the reality is that sometimes the monsters live right next door. Sometimes they blend in so well that even the keenest eyes fail to see them. And when tragedy strikes, the realization that evil was always near is often the most devastating blow of all. Still, even in a story shaped by horror, there is something worth carrying forward. Jacob's name became a promise that children deserve safety, a promise that their voices matter, a promise that even when justice fails, society can choose to evolve. The truth about Jacob Wetterling burns, but from that fire came resolve. A resolve that continues to protect children long after Jacob left this world. As I close this final chapter, I think about Jacob's question. What did I do wrong? The answer now and forever is nothing. Jacob did nothing wrong. The world failed him. The systems meant to protect him failed. The adults who should have connected the warning signs failed. The man who took him was driven not by reason but by darkness. But Jacob's legacy rises above all of that. His life, though short, reshaped a nation. And his story will continue to remind us that vigilance, compassion, and truth are the only tools we have against the shadows that lurk at the edges of our communities. This is where the investigation ends. But Jacob's story does not end here. It lives on in every law that bears his name, in every child kept safer because of him, in every parent who hugs their son or daughter a little tighter. Jacob Wetterling may have been taken decades ago, but he is not forgotten. His story is a reminder. His story is a warning. His story is a legacy.